particular slide is showing change in new listings between this summer, from May to July of this summer versus last summer. And the darker blue areas are larger decline, and pink areas are basically an increase. So if you look at the table on the right, these are really the only about dozen or a little more than a dozen metro areas that we've seen increase in new listings. Otherwise, everywhere has been a decline. And if you look at the top table, it's mostly all in California, Yeah. So when I was mentioning the tale of two markets,
right,
and then Madison in here, I'm actually getting ready to present in Madison, Wisconsin. So I had that in there. But a couple things I was looking at here. One is obviously what's happening to new listings and just this stark difference between sort of West Coast markets or Western markets versus Southeastern markets. Mm-hmm. And then also the question of, I'm sure we've talked about this on the show, but does lack of occupancy of Airbnb and lack of utilization of vacation homes make any difference in terms of new inventories coming on market? And I'm not really seeing that. I mean, there is some indication, but not something that we can really generalize based on. So the two top areas are Flagstaff, which is Sedona, Arizona. That's a vacation market, right? Yeah. And then Temple, Texas, which is like sort of north of Austin. I don't know that that's necessarily a vacation market. It may be a little bit more out of urban area, sort of less density, but I don't know what to make out of that particular market. And then there's like a number of markets in North Midwest. So nothing is really telling me that anytime soon there's going to be improvement, although there is areas that are doing better than other areas.
Well, and now when you say improvement, you mean more inventory.
More inventory. Yeah. Right. In my mind, inventory helps, and because there's more transactions,
Right. And inventory allows title companies, mortgage companies, and real estate agents to increase their volume. When you have more inventory, you have more to sell. I mean, look, if you owned a shoe store and you didn't have any shoes to sell, business would not be good, right? You need some inventory, right? So yeah, I completely get it. And, you mentioned the Airbnb phenomenon, and there's been a lot of really fake news about that, especially one YouTuber that's a complete sensationalist. He's a purveyor of doom and gloom. He's just always been wrong, but, he's getting a lot of press out of it. The Airbnb thing definitely has a small effect, but it's not very pronounced. It's not that big a deal. The Airbnb sellers that do sell, they don't all come on the market the same day. Okay, that this is a slow process of dropping inventory into a market that is very inventory constricted. So that is not enough to cause a crash. It's interesting that people make a big deal out of that. Okay, anything else to show us? This is interesting.
Sure. Let's see. Well, this is the variation in total home sales activity, right? We were talking about inventory, but this is about home sales activity. And I single out on the right-hand side California here just because California has had such a huge drop relative to other areas. Yeah. But again, I'm comparing first half of this year versus first half of 2019. And that is because I'm trying to avoid all the, abnormalities that happen. Yeah. COVID. Yeah. Right.
Those are a lot of distortions. So you have to just take out COVID largely.
Right. Right. And if we go back to 2019 levels, that would not by itself be that bad either. So sort of the last normal year in many ways. But you can see also the continuation of that tale of two markets where the western part of the country is just not seeing as many transactions as Southeast and, particularly Southeast and South. So, one reason that I talked about was the inventory. The other is obviously affordability, right? Because these markets on the western side of the country are also more expensive and have seen to some extent, a lot of them more appreciation during the pandemic, which made them so much more unaffordable at this point, particularly as we don't see as much out migration to some of them. Like when you think of Boise City, another, pandemic boom town, it was sort of the poster child of in migration. So not doing so well at the moment.
Yeah. Well, it's just got overhyped. Boise was, everybody from California moved to Boise, and And then, you had to give some of that back. Okay.
Right.
It just got overheated. But this is interesting because it shows that California has the lowest level of home sales volume. That's what we're talking about here, sales volume, since 2007. What is interesting about this too, Selma, is the sort of ripple effect of all of the realtors and all of the mortgage people and all of the title companies and all of the people that make money off of transactions, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're suffering greatly, right? And so the way they tighten up and don't spend money into the economy so much unless they have a side hustle, which many of them do, that's an interesting knock-on effect as well. Okay, good. And then the other thing though, Selma, is the rental market. If you'd like to talk about that a little bit, we'd love to hear more about that.
Okay, so basically we're tracking single family rents here. This is out of the MLS, right? So if it's transacting in MLS, it would be captured here. Not all single family rentals transact in MLS, but we have pretty good sample of transactions, right? And so you can see the surge in rent growth through last summer when it peaked at 20%, and then that precipitous decline. I mean, this very much mirrors what happened with home prices, right? Almost identical. Now, we do break the data down to 4 different tiers of single family rentals. And so I'm showing low tier and high tier. And we've seen a little bit more slowing of rent growth in high tier versus low tier. And I think that's a reflection of inventory differences, right? Low inventory has already been so constrained to begin with. And then high tier saw more appreciation earlier in pandemic because those were the folks who could move around and drive that growth. But in terms of rent growth at the moment, so these are monthly data in terms of month-over-month changes in rents. And we are now, the red line, the darker red, the burgundy line is year 2023. And through most of this year, it's been moving in line with historical averages. If you look at blue, gray, and purple line, those are 2017, 18, 19. So 2023 is moving in line of those. And then it falls off in August of this year, or, at least declines. And that's not necessarily sort of in line with the seasonal patterns we're showing. But okay, so I'm comparing here rent growth on a year-over-year basis in August of last year versus August of this year. And the darker green bar is this August. And you can see on the bottom 4 metro areas that sort of have been standing out in terms of more negative impacts or more declines in terms of home prices and multifamily rents and single family rents over the last 6 months as a result.
But are those declines in rents, or are they just decelerations in rents? There's a big difference. Yeah.
Right. So here we're looking at the darker blue lines. We were actually looking at the declines on.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, on 4 of the markets. So, and these are such obvious markets, by the way.
Right.
Miami,
right.
which got totally overheated, not a market you would want to invest in. Austin, which got massively overheated. Las Vegas, also overheated. And of course, Scottsdale, with, that has maybe one of the biggest Airbnb busts in the country in Scottsdale. So I can see why rents would definitely have gone a little bit negative in those markets. But everything else is positive, even though the rent growth is slower.
Right.
Still positive, though. Yeah.
The other thing that's really interesting to me, too, is the strongest rent growth right now remains in Midwest. And Midwest sort of was a laggard during the pandemic. People were leaving places like Chicago, St. Louis. I mean, it's never been like a top ranking city for when you think of immigration or price growth or anything like that. But now it's, now we do see relatively more growth in area like that, like St. Louis, Chicago, Boston, and New York. And Boston, New York, Chicago were the 3 areas that were actually declining earlier in the pandemic as people were leaving. So in many ways, it's, the rents are catching up. If they didn't grow before, now they're catching up to rate of growth that other areas were experiencing, which has been really interesting to me because I don't know necessarily that we were expecting this at this point. The other one, for example,
Chicago has performed really well. That's amazing. I mean, it performed really well in 2022, and it's the number 3 best performer in 2023.